This is the California Liberty Project podcast.
So welcome back to the California Liberty Project podcast. My name is Greg, and I appreciate everyone being here and joining me again. Make sure to follow us and subscribe on Spotify, on Apple, Google, even Instagram at California Liberty Project. And I'm trying to get better about tweeting and even uploading videos to YouTube where I can, when I can, and when they don't get struck down. So I've mentioned that before, but that's a constant battle. I upload when I can, but certainly always on Spotify, Apple, Google. Make sure to follow us there and share and like. But for today, we want to jump right into it. Really happy to be joined by a great guest, CJ Engel. And I've heard of and seen some of CJ's work through the years, I think even dating back possibly to the Tom Woods podcast or others. And most recently, I've been really intrigued by CJ's work over at the Chronicles Magazine podcast, which is a really great new-ish podcast that I've been watching that covers a lot of really cool ideas about culture, politics, and whatnot. And CJ is essentially the host of the Chronicles Magazine podcast. It's definitely worth checking out. I really enjoy it. And so CJ, welcome to the California Liberty Project podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining us today. So let's jump right in. Talk about as much of this as you'd like to, but I think some of your own journey kind of mirrors mine, or possibly mine mirrors yours, or what have you. But I think a lot of people that were coming from libertarianism, specifically, I've known a lot of Austro-libertarians, certainly, and maybe even right libertarians or paleo-libertarians, who have kind of been on a journey, it seems like. Maybe after reading some right-wing thought, maybe after reading like Mencius Moldbug, Curtis Yarvin, or maybe just having their own spontaneous journey. But I think a lot of us have had a journey or an awakening from libertarianism, and then wanted to expand and learn more about ideas on the right, and just cultural ideas, Western civilization, more of the history, and even philosophy, dare I say. So where are you on that journey currently, on your own journey? And is that a fair characterization of maybe where you've been and where you're at, or where you're going?
Yeah, a couple people, a number of different people that I've known over the years, they kind of refer to what's happening as a sort of post-libertarianism. And so that can mean different things to different people. People can find themselves, in different areas of the right, or really the anti-left. There's different ways of saying it, but I really like the phrase post-libertarianism because it's really broad enough to describe what's happening. And not everybody is going to the same places. Some people are seeking refuge, ideological refuge, in various portions of the anti-left, or you could even call it the anti-Americanist ideology, that as it's developed in the 20th century. And just a lot of people, they, like myself and presumably yourself, they realize that there's, the world has shifted in so dramatic a sense over the last 20 years that trying to keep our bearings about us has been proven, increasingly difficult. And the idea of like just remaining firm and sticking to the old libertarian creed, it really presents unique challenges that have libertarians haven't had an opportunity to grapple with in times past. The libertarian movement of the 1970s and 1980s, they faced completely different circumstances than we face today. And so libertarianism and the people that have, learned about it, digested it, and they're trying to apply it to the current world are facing, a really unique set of dilemmas. And I think that some of those dilemmas we'll get into today, but I think that just describes the current that I've been swimming in over the last several years is this post-libertarian instinct.
Yeah, absolutely. I've had some great guests on this new and kind of growing podcast here, California Liberty Project, but I've spoken to folks, obviously such as yourself, but I've talked with Buck Johnson, Pete Quinones, and others too, who have been on a really interesting journey. And for me, for the past couple of years or so, maybe more, I've been saying that libertarianism is correct, but not complete. It is not a complete worldview or a complete philosophy. It's great applied to certain instances of trying to rein in government. To me, the non-aggression principle is extremely obvious. It's like, well, yeah, of course, it's kind of stemming from Judeo-Christian values and whatnot. All of these things, like don't steal from others, don't damage their property, don't aggress upon the rights of another. It all sounds very obvious, and I think yes, those lessons and those dictates still apply, those ideas still apply, but I just don't think that libertarianism itself, qua libertarianism or as libertarianism alone in a vacuum, I don't think it's enough to build a strong civil society.
Mm-hmm.
Let me ask you, is a values neutral kind of classical liberal society, is it possible, first of all, or is it even desirable in your view?
I don't think it's possible. And I think that's one of the problems that libertarians have had is there was a debate a couple of years back over what was termed a thick libertarianism versus a thin libertarianism. And the thick libertarians at that time were talking about the fact that, not only did we need to talk about the non-aggression principle and, the absolute rights of property that individuals should have, but we also should care about some of these more general social justice themes. That was kind of the phrase back in the day. There was the social justice warriors, which you don't see that phrase anymore.
Right.
But that was kind of the thing, is like, as individuals, even if we're not going to use the state to help implement our ideas, we had to, as we were obligated as humans to kind of just take part in what was happening on these types of cultural matters. The thin libertarians, saw this as sort of capitulating to regime narratives. And they said that actually libertarianism needs to remain strictly a very thin slice of political theory where we can have these, strictly defined boundaries on the state, or even for those who didn't want the state, they would be bound by these really strict legal principles, having to do with aggression and the logical derivatives of that principle. And so I think that whole debate kind of fell apart because the thin libertarians, they at the same time they were trying to articulate the need for something more expansive. In order for society to function, in order for it to be healthy, we needed to have commitments outside of whatever these very specific and very carefully defined aspects of the legal system. We needed to think beyond that, and we needed to treat libertarianism as something that fits within a broader view of things. And so the whole thick versus thin debate kind of broke down, in my opinion, because people realized that we did need more than libertarianism, and libertarianism wasn't worth coming back to the same old razor thin debates that had taken place over the previous 10 years, because we were in a state of cultural and sociological emergency.
Yeah, I agree. I guess one of the things I was going to ask you, and it sounds like we're in agreement, but first and foremost, I think it's a fair question for any of us to ask our neighbors or ourselves. Are we in a state of cultural decay? And I don't mean to be pedantic with that question, but some people will, some left libertarians, for example, Cato types, if you've seen some of their Instagram posts, celebrating Pride Month and gay rights or LGBT rights, or, they're coming from capitalism, whatnot. But some people think everything is fine right now. Things are going really well, and they would almost deny that there is a state of cultural decay, CJ. And I think it's fair to say that you and I would, it sounds like, agree with each other that we are in some kind of accelerated cultural decay, first and foremost. Is that fair? Are we in agreement there?
I absolutely. And there's a good reason these libertarians don't see it as a state of decay, because for every decay, there's always a buildup of something that's trying to replace it, and it really exposes the fact that there's two completely different libertarian camps, and some people have noted that that one camp is associated with like the Mises types, the Mises
Yes.
Institute types. Others are associated with DC libertarianism and all the think tanks and, massive endowments and funds that they get.
Right.
And they're completely different cultures. They're completely different visions and way of life and interpretation of history and the interpretation of progress. Is progress something that we can use to describe us? And so, yeah, these are completely different visions. And I think that debate actually exposes part of the problem that libertarianism is facing. It's unable to maintain any sort of cultural cohesion or cultural consensus, and that's why libertarianism is breaking down. Is because it's exposed the fact that you can't build a movement on mere intellectual assent to 10 propositions. That's not
Right.
how society grows. That's not how culture grows, and that's ultimately not how movements grow. There was, one of the interesting stories I read when I was struggling with this 3 years ago was the experience of various ex-socialists, ex-Marxists, and they came to the conclusion that Marxists are actually very smart. A lot of people think they're just dumb and wacky, but there's actually an intellectual class of Marxists that are brilliant, and they've kind of figured out the world according to their own formulations to a very precise degree, to a degree so precise that libertarianism is probably the only other precise doctrine like Marxism. But these ex-socialists began to realize that it was actually it was not characteristic of a very healthy society just to have mere agreement in these propositions. They needed something more at the sentimental and cultural level that would sustain them. They realized that it was healthier to have a society where there is disagreement than to have everyone be a Marxist but nobody actually get along. I think that's really analogous to what happened in libertarianism. Is we realized we were from completely different worlds. We had completely conflicting visions, and it
Right.
broke apart.
Exactly. I had written a few years back an article on the left-right divide in libertarianism. And for me, I always found it perplexing that there are so many, capital L type libertarians, many of whom are our friends or allies or what have you, but so many of them put the blinders on and say, we're not left or right. We just
Yeah.
believe in, we believe in freedom, and full stop. Right. And I always found that to be, you know, crazy, incorrect, because there is always this tension. People have been talking about it for years in the liberty camp. There's always a tension between, it used to be the social justice warriors, as you mentioned. Now it's kind of woke, whatever it is, cultural Marxism. I know that's a sloppy term. It's a non-academic term, but, there's always that tension between those folks on that camp. And then, of course, more of the Ron Paul people and the Mises Institute gang and, Lou Rockwell and
Mm-hmm.
Murray Rothbard. And there was this natural divide there. And people, in the capital L type libertarian movement would kind of bang their head against the desk and say, huh, this is so weird. No, we're not Republicans. We're not Democrats or left or right. I can't seem to figure out where this divide is coming from. And I wrote this article saying, well, duh, it's the left-right divide manifesting itself naturally, organically, and spontaneously. You can pretend it isn't there. You can pretend that libertarianism is some new thing that's different in a vacuum with no cultural values associated with it. But life finds a way, so to speak, like from Jurassic Park. This is going to happen because it's organic and spontaneous, the left, right, almost dare I say dialectic in society.
Mm-hmm.
That's where I was coming from on that. I think I agree with your sentiments there.
Yeah, I do want to say too, I do agree that there are organic elements to this, but I'm really of the opinion that culture is driven by politics now. This is kind of the consequence of the managerial revolution in the 20th century, and that
Mm,
culture and politics, the dynamic there has completely swapped over the last 100 years. And it used to be you might be able to say in the 19th century that politics was downstream from culture, but I don't think you can say that now. And I think that people like Murray Rothbard have really pointed out the fact that culture has been the product of the administrative state in the 20th century,
yes.
especially in the latter half of the 20th century, and now everything's kind of shifted and upside down, and culture flows from politics now.
Yes, and I heard, I think it was Aaron McIntyre just the other day, great thinker, great follow on Twitter and whatnot. He has some great thoughts. he was saying that he agrees with so much of Andrew Breitbart, and I think Andrew Breitbart was a great warrior, a happy warrior. But he was saying that essentially, kind of similar to what you're saying, that basically culture oftentimes is actually downstream from power.
Hmm.
And I think that was really an astute and simple statement, because I think it's hard to deny that if you look at all the data, all the evidence of the past, let's say at least 3 years, right?
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, we tend to conceive of culture as just, I mean, a lot of it is our way of thinking, and the narratives and the emphasis and the priorities that we place on things like the free market. Um, anybody, and this is something that's true of traditionalists and reactionaries, like where I see myself going, and libertarians who are critical of the managerial state. Both of them realize that the 20th century cannot be described as a free market. And if it can't be described as a free market, then a lot of the cultural elements that have been happening can find their source in the elite sections of this new managerial economic system. It's not organic and it's not bottom up, but it's really top down, and it comes from institutions like the Federal Reserve and some of the agents of dispersion of all this capital. That kind of flows from the center there. But at the end of the day, the culture, especially now, is downstream from power, and in our time, economic power in particular.
Yeah, that's really well put. That's really, I think
And
that's critical.
this is something that people like Oren have been talking about, but they get this from people like Paul Gottfried. He's been talking
Sure.
about this for before Oren came onto the scene. I mean, this is something that he and his buddies at Chronicles in the '90s have been talking about from a long time. Is the idea that we still have this like federal republic and that we need to preserve it and fight for it is nonsensical. There was the abolition of the old America and the creation of a new one. And, this came about in stages, but the 20th century really transformed the entire structure of things. And so now, yes, the culture is downstream from power. And this is kind of the point of even like Murray Rothbard's history of the progressive era. I mean,
Hmm.
that's the transformation of the American system into something completely new.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right about Paul Gottfried, a fascinating scholar, and he's been doing this for almost 50 years, I believe. People should definitely check out Paul's many books, his many works, scholarly works on this. And it's interesting too. You mentioned Paul, and recently there's been a little bit of a kerfuffle, or at least an intellectual skirmish that I found fascinating, as far as wokeness and social justice. Does it originate with Marxism? I think a lot of like Fox News, Hannity types, just normal everyday conservatives
Mm-hmm.
might say, "Oh yeah, this is just neo-Marxism," or "This is Marxism," which is very sloppy. When they're referring to all the cultural rot, the decay, the so-called cultural Marxism. But is it really actually true Marxism? And I think Paul Gottfried has done great work, and scholarly work as well, just noting that this bears no resemblance to true classical Marxism. Now,
Mm-hmm.
I am not a Marxist. I'm an anti-Marxist. I think the economics is garbage. That's completely wrong, and the labor theory of value and so forth. But Marxism, I think there's strong evidence that it is not woke, contrary to what maybe James Lindsay and some other folks who are newer on the scene are saying, that this is Marxist or vaguely neo-Marxist. Where do you weigh in on that kind of current conversation over the past few months?
I agree with Paul. And that should be obvious to anyone. I've gotten to know Paul very well. I'm actually working on a biography of Paul, and so I've gotten to know him very well. And I take his position on so many different things, and this is one of them. I agree with him that you could best characterize this current left as a post-Marxist left. I agree with him that Marxism fell apart, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and it fell apart in stages, and the intellectuals kind of fled, and they had to rethink things and reorient themselves and their priorities. And I think they abandoned the Marxist framework of material dialectical change in the world, and they abandoned the emphasis on economic categories. And I think they took up something that came from the contributions of psychology, and they also captured the capitalist class. Sorry about that. I think I had a little bit of an internet glitch there, but but to finish my point, I think that we are experiencing and seeing a post-Marxist left. I think they've rejected all of the old economic framework that defined Marxism in general. And a lot of times people like James Lindsay will say that the new left, the woke left, is culturally Marxist because they still use the dynamics of the oppressed versus the oppressor. But one of the things that Paul Gottfried's pointed out is that there's so many other camps, anti-liberal or just non-liberal camps that speak in those terms as well. They talk about, I mean, even people like Hans Hoppe and other libertarians, they've used this language to describe the dynamics of those in power and those outside of power in society. And so the new left uses a completely different framework. A lot of it borrows from like the contributions of psychology. That's why Paul Gottfried uses the phrase the therapeutic state. So I do think that this new post-Marxist left is indeed post-Marxist. I think that they are leveraging the rhetoric of liberalism, like individual rights and free expression and freedom of speech. They're leveraging those things in order to implement a new, like, liberal totalitarianism, where they use these themes to their advantage. Of course, it's not consistent because they are on the left and they're not interested actually in an equal society. They don't believe in individualism. They believe in their vision of things, and they're going to operate within the rhetoric and the bounds of permissible thinking that kind of appeals to just the everyday American that has grown up on like John Locke and Thomas Jefferson and some of those things. So they're employing that language, and they have no interest in an economic class warfare, but instead they use therapeutic class warfare, and they turn everything on those hinges and emphasize things like sexism and racism and all of those categories.
Yes, and I think just a month or two ago in Chronicles Magazine, which I'm a subscriber of, so I encourage anyone and everyone to subscribe, definitely. But I read a great piece by, I believe it was Alexander Riley, I want to credit him, where I think a lot of the post-Marxist left, which I like that term, I think it's very fitting, very accurate. I think a lot of them, kind of like what you're intimating at, is that they're able to kind of coast on the fumes of this spectacular society that was built up, but that society, it kind of became a vacuum, and nature abhors a vacuum, right? Or the classical liberal vacuum. It has some great ideas, but they're not enough. They're not sufficient to build and maintain a society, maybe. And I think Alexander Riley was arguing some of that. We're just coasting on the fumes of a greater society, and the post-Marxist left is happy to do that. Like you're saying, they adopt some of the rhetoric, some of the language of good old-fashioned liberals, but they don't believe any of that. They're pragmatists at the end of the day.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a distinction between what I would call a historicist liberalism and a universalist liberalism. And the historicist liberalism are the themes of liberty that came out of the British tradition. That'd be like Edmund Burke, who was not a traditionalist at his time. He was a liberal, but he was part of a liberal in the way that the principles of his type of liberalism were derived from the British historical development and politics. The rights that he claimed fealty to came from his own circumstances, the own development of the British tradition. And that's a historicist liberalism. So you can have these themes like private property and individual liberty and even free association and free speech and all these themes. They have to be interpreted within the context of political dynamics over time. That's historicist liberalism. That type of liberalism is completely impossible today. Then there's the universalist liberalism. You could call it the French liberalism, where they didn't look at these themes as deriving from their own political developments, but they looked at them independent of society and something that society needed to work itself toward. All societies can only be considered just if they adhere to and they conform to these universalist standards. So these two types of liberalism are often clouded together. They're often blurred together, but I think it's important to make those distinctions. The modern 20th century liberals, who are not liberals at all, they use the rhetoric of the French tradition, where it's universalist, and that's why they have internationalist efforts to try to expand liberties, and they make sure that all Western societies are democracies, so-called, and they use these liberal convictions and priorities to expand their influence around the world. They don't appeal to their liberties as derived from a specific society like the British tradition, but they're really universalistic.
Right.
But even though they are using this rhetoric, they're actually not implementing it at all. They're actually more interested in their own political power hegemony.
Yeah, and that's the really interesting thing too about us here as Americans. And I love this country. I love our tradition. I do admit I love Jefferson. I have an admiration for Locke, but I realize that a lot of that needs to be backfilled, with cultural aspects. But the cool thing is, the amazing thing is, and you were mentioning historicist liberalism, almost in the Burkean tradition, and of course Burke supported our revolution, and I'm not sure where he stood on the concept of natural rights, but natural rights, which is, basically that now has been absorbed into conserving, or at least part of the right here in America. But I understand the tension there because natural rights themselves can be revolutionary, right? And if we're not careful, if you get just a little bit beyond natural rights, you start packing or accreting other things onto that, you very quickly you're into the French tradition, which is radical egalitarianism, which
Mm-hmm.
gets into positive rights. And it's a very, I don't want to say a fine line, but we have to be very careful there.
Yeah, we have to pay.
Maintaining natural rights, but then not
Right.
becoming radicals like the psychotic people of the Jacobins in the French tradition. Go ahead there. You're going to
Yeah,
comment on that.
well, I mean, we just have to be aware of the corruption of that language. I mean, that was kind of the Wilsonian, Rooseveltian um, contribution to political society, was the corruption of these things for the interests of the managerial state.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So bringing things back to California here, California Liberty Project, and this is really more of a national story at this point, but the LA Dodgers thing,
Hmm.
so of course it's our new national Ramadan month, as people have been referring to it. It's the big new religious holiday. June has arrived. We're recording this, of course, in early June, and every major corporation in the land, as we've all been discussing, they all have to bend the knee. They all have to fly the flag of the conqueror, and on and on and on. And there's been the big controversy with the Dodgers. Excuse me. And obviously they're gonna honor this anti-Catholic group that blasphemes Jesus Christ, and is very insulting to religious symbology and whatnot. Um, and it's exploded into this national controversy, of course, that we're all talking about. Um, Let me step back and ask the big question, the obvious question that we've been talking about, that so many people have been batting around. Why, in your opinion, does it seem that every corporation must bend the knee and so outwardly, so visibly go through this genuflection, this religious ceremony every June at this point in time?
Hmm.
Why, in your opinion, are we here culturally?
There's two answers to that. One is that they really believe it. One is that they've been so like drunk on this new ideology that they're zealots about it. They like sort of like
Hmm.
this, religious fervor that has just completely captured their mind, and they can't see the world in any other way than the idea that they are, would be martyrs to like the Inquisition or something. Like they really think that they are freedom fighters. They've been completely drunk on this stuff, and I think that's true for a lot of people, especially downstream from it. On the
True
other hand,
believers. Yeah.
yeah, and on the other hand, there are interested parties in maintaining cultural conformity, and
Hmm.
these types of people, and this is kind of like the contribution. There's a book by Sam Francis, Leviathan. I think it's Leviathan and Its Enemies.
Hmm.
And he elaborates on sort of the contributions of like James Burnham and sort of the science of power. And
Hmm.
he talks about the fact that there's a class of people who leverage ideology for their own benefit. They themselves are not true believers, but they're above it, and they use it and they employ it for their own benefit. So when you have all of these corporations, towing the line, so to speak, I think that they're afraid to see the various types of legislation and legal code that have been derived from the civil rights revolution in the 1960s and 70s. There's been a complete reconstruction of the legal code so as to make these people, these companies, liable to the point of bankruptcy if they don't participate in these trends. And the reason is because the CEOs and all the decision makers, they're all employees of the company. They're all employees of the owners of the company. The owners of the company are the shareholders. The major shareholders in all these corporations are massive hedge funds. They're massive, funds that are all owned by like very similar people, and they are all directing these things. And the people that actually work there, the CEO and the marketing officers and all those people, they have to toe the line or they'll get fired and they'll get crushed. And I think so a lot of that basically is just fear of being sued and fear of financial loss and and fear of backlash of the shareholders, who are not just you and me, but the actual fund managers and the people that have a voice on these things. And so those types of people are the ones that are really pushing this. I don't think that I mean there are true believers, there are zealots there, but
Useful
I don't
idiots.
think that that's at the basis. I think their zealous mentality is actually derived from the managerial elite themselves. They've crafted these people to work for them. And so I think that's kind of where the ideology comes in. It's at the second layer of power, not the primary inertia of all of this.
Yeah, I think that's right. Power. So much of this goes back to pragmatism and the study of power. And all those great Italian writers who have kind of developed that, and then certainly into Burnham. But I think a lot of the, as you were mentioning, a lot of the true believers, or the NPCs, to use a meme term. But I think a lot of them just kind of go along with this because of that burning human instinct to just belong and to genuflect before power. And I think that's how so many of the masses kind of go along with this. And then it turns into almost a bullying thing, a conformity thing. But yeah, I think you make a really good point about
I don't know if you broke
the
up or
hedge
not,
funds.
but I agree with that analysis.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Hopefully you can
No,
hear me.
you're still here. I can hear you. Yeah, and a lot of the large hedge funds, the BlackRock, the Vanguard, and a lot of those types of outfits. The question in my mind is, why do they want this cultural conformity? Why are they pushing it? I understand, I think, why so many of the true believers kind of go along with it, because they want to genuflect to true power. And true power it's not even found in governments these days. It is like these BlackRocks, the Vanguards and whatnot. But why are these hedge funds so intent on pushing this cultural, should I say, just homogeneity?
Mm-hmm. You know the phrase in economics, creative destruction?
Yes.
I think it's similar to that. It's not creative, but it is destruction. And in destruction comes opportunity. In destruction comes the ability to, harmonize economic interests into yourself, into your own vision of things. And I think that's part of it too. I mean, there's a certain humiliation aspect to it too. I mean, humiliating conservative Catholics or conservative Christians in general can have very large payoffs economically and politically down the pipeline if you can disorient them and make them realize that they are an occupied people, and make them feel like they no longer have a role in society. And I think humiliation is a really powerful aspect to all of this too. There are political benefits to destroying the cultural homogeneity, the cultural cohesion, the cultural the ability for people to connect together within the same community. You tear that apart, you can capture power. I mean, one of the lessons that James Burnham talked about, is the ability of real opposition is the only way to confront actual political power. You need to have some sort of political power yourself in order to legitimately confront something. And so by weakening them and preventing coalitions and preventing, power blocks to gather together to confront you, keeping people separate and keeping people tearing at each other's throats has massive political payoffs to those in power.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the scary thing. At the end of the day, this could be a very, very cynical ploy for just, power worship, I think. And then I think this leftward cultural drift is maybe first of all enabled coming out of our classical liberal kind of cultural milieu, and then it drifts into this power struggle that we're seeing here that you just so aptly described.
Mm-hmm.
Let me ask you as well, being a Californian myself, regarding places like California. And obviously California is widely panned and criticized and mocked as being one of the most nutty kind of liberal states, whether that's New York, California, what have you. Certainly California is one of the top, liberal states. As liberal, I know that's a loaded term, right? In scare quotes, but
Sure,
progressive,
yeah.
woke.
Progressive.
Yeah. Okay. So given that, but this is something that I talk about often on our California podcast here, is that we have large swaths of California that are not culturally woke, progressive, statist necessarily. They're huge swaths of the state. Land. I mean, the land, of course, used to be what was represented in the Senate. That's a whole separate conversation, as the California Republic. But huge swaths of the land, big chunks of the people, are very conservative, sometimes populist, and even libertarian, certainly up in kind of the state of Jefferson, up in Northeast California and the deserts. And let me ask your opinion, given our conversation up till now, what is the solution for the state of California or places like this, where maybe people in the working Central Valley or people out in the mountains and deserts, where they feel completely, well, they're not represented, they feel abandoned and even targeted. Many of the industries here that the so-called working class work in are targeted by Sacramento. Farms, ranches with water, oil, gas, minerals. They're targeted with these radical environmental regimes and lawsuits. What is the solution? I mean, should people just get up, move their families, and flee the state, or is there, in your opinion, a value to fighting back or to standing up for your local community in a broader, in a huge state where for some of us, Sacramento is many hours away? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't know where you are in California, but California is a very misunderstood place politically.
Yes.
I think it's more conservative even than most people realize. Like there's a lot of people flooding to Texas, the major hubs in Texas to find better economic opportunities and a less intense cultural atmosphere, in their opinion. But I think there's actually, there's not as many economically beneficial places in rural California, but I would put up rural California culture as a conservative bulwark against most of the suburban areas in Texas or any other place. There's places like Arkansas and Idaho that are probably more conservative than California, but where I live in like Colfax area, which is up outside of Tahoe, and it's it's way more conservative than people could possibly imagine for California. It's old mining territory. I mean, there's still people here that have their stakes and they're still looking for gold, and they have absolutely no interest in, the left, cultural or otherwise. They're very conservative, and I can't picture my region as ever going woke. It's so ingrained in even the geography in the mountains. You can't develop it. You can't bring in a lot of these tech firms up here. It's just completely culturally, what's the word? It doesn't change very swiftly at all. There's continuity over time in places like, the mountainous areas. So I guess what I would advise is two things. One, individual particularity. Where are you in life? What obligations do you have? Like those of us who have families, that's our primary obligation. The idea that we're going to go to Sacramento and become a representative, I think, is beyond the scope of our own obligations and our own priorities. Like, raise your family well. I mean, that has long-term payoffs in a much more powerful way than any immediate legislative efforts, could have, and those types of things. The other thing I would suggest is being very regionally conscious. Where are you? Don't think of yourself as a Californian, but where are you regionally within that context? And what tools do you have? What friends do you have? And what is the general atmosphere of that area?
Yes.
And one of the problems right now that I'm facing where I live is we're getting a lot of like Bay Area expats, and they consider themselves more conservative because they're not on board with all of the the most recent extension of the woke revolution. But at the
Sure.
same time, when they come into my area, they're seen as liberal because, just compared to where they come from, they're actually really conservative, but they're actually very liberal when they
Right.
come up here too. So I would just be more aware of building up networks of people that recognize and at least are aware of what is happening, like migrationally, and what can you do to preserve the area. But like this is another problem with California is it's very diverse
Yes.
regionally. It's very
Yes.
diverse. It's probably just as diverse regionally as America as a whole. I mean,
Yeah.
we have San Francisco for sure. We have Los Angeles for sure. But we have places that are more rugged and undeveloped, developable than like a Texas or anything like that too. So regional consciousness is a part of it. Like if you live in like the Bay Area, yeah,
Hmm.
for sure, get out. But like the
Yeah.
idea that you're going to let Newsom bug you as someone who lives up in the hills, I think you're going to find that other governors have more influence over your life than Californians here. Like we all, there was a funny, I don't want to get anyone in trouble, but
Okay.
I know people that participate with local sheriffs in things like hunting and fishing that are at odds with California law, and it's just part of the culture here. And the
Sure.
culture is more powerful than the employment of legal tactics to get you in trouble. Like I grew up in a really small mountain town, where things like hunting and fishing, it's heavily regulated in California, but there's
Yes.
no enforcement of that because the culture was just so, consistent with older ways of American life.
Yeah. And I think you make a really good point about California's geography.
Mhm.
One of the things I talk about is these clear geographic boundaries, which are also cultural boundaries. And they're a powerful metaphor. Like the city of San Francisco, as many people famously know, is surrounded on three sides by water. It's almost an island of progressivism,
Mhm.
wokeness to itself. The whole Bay Area is kind of surrounded by mountains and water. It's almost like an island of whatever you consider it, wokeism. Then we have the Coast Range along the coast for several hundred miles, runs kind of northwest, southeast, parallel to the coastline. And it insulates, if you want to you push this metaphor further, it insulates much of the Central Valley, which is more working class, working lower middle class folks. A lot of Mexican ancestry there. There are Basques, there are Hmong people, lots of different immigrants coming together. But definitely a working class area, which is insulated, if you will, by the mountains from the
Mhm.
coastal LA, the Bay Area, and so forth. Then we have the deserts and, like you're saying, the mountains, which are they're harder to reach, they're harder to develop. Maybe they're considered more remote, and hence you can have these little great, cool pockets of localism where people just live with each other, hopefully respecting each other's property and cultures and traditions. And I think that is a really good metaphor for the state, which, like you're mentioning,
Yeah.
people don't realize the incredible diversity of our state here.
Yeah, it's people. I mean, people across America, they just they think most people think of California as just like the entire thing is Los Angeles or something.
Right.
And
And
it's
Disneyland.
hilarious. It's
Yeah.
hilarious how wrong that is. I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
California was always like a conservative bulwark, like up until Reagan,
Right.
so it's a very politically captured state for sure. Like the Democrats, and I don't mean to say that in a way that's like Republicans are good, Democrats are bad, like
Yeah.
bad. I have zero interest in that, but I should say like the left, that pervades both parties.
Right.
They've politically castrated, the state in a way that's not representative of most of the state. I think most of the state actually is conservative.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of wisdom in what you say as well. It almost goes hand in hand with, for me, I'm a Catholic, and the idea of subsidiarity. It's
Hmm.
like, let's take care of our spheres of influence, our kids, our wives, our families, then our neighbors, right, and our local community. There's a lot of work to do just right there
Hmm.
to protect and to build and to keep our organic communities safe and vibrant. And then, yeah, we've always got pollution and garbage coming at us and hyper-regulation from San Francisco, well, Sacramento in particular. And what we can do is focus local. In the meantime, I'll also support or cheer on movements like the state of Jefferson. If they can get that going county by county, I'll be a supporter. I think California is ripe to be broken up because of some of these cultural reasons and
Yeah.
whatnot that we've discussed.
I would say too, like in conclusion, a lot of people Like they'll go to the state of Jefferson and all that stuff, and I think those are great, healthy. They help shape people's recognition that you don't have to stay with like an oppressive place forever. But at the same time, um, we can't just thrive on these things. We have to actually capture power. I don't think there's
Yeah.
any way of of confronting the left that's in power without actually having power themselves. So I would encourage those interested in the state of Jefferson, which I am. I'm very interested in those types of movements. I would encourage them to also think about what they can do to actually capture power. You have to hold power at the local level and tell Sacramento no. You can't just
Right.
be an individual and sign petitions or, go to protests or write to your representative or all that stuff. That's not actually exercising power. You have to think about what can I do? What can we do as a community to actually put people in power to have the authority to say no and to stand up to Sacramento?
Awesome. Fully agree. Let me ask you one really quick question before I let you go to honor the time commitment. If you have it off the top of your head, what are 2 or maybe 3 books that anyone listening to this podcast or your listeners, what books should people read that they might not have read in the typical kind of liberty canon? What do you
Yeah.
recommend? It's wide open there.
Yeah. So, I'm a huge Paul Gottfried fan. I think the ability to interpret the world around us, I think, is a really, you have to have the arsenal to properly interpret it. If you misinterpret it, you're going to have, misconstrued solutions. And I can't think of a better book than Multiculturalism and the Politics of Guilt by Paul Gottfried.
Okay.
That book really has done a lot in understanding why, the modern left uses therapeutic language, where the therapeutic state, as he calls it, comes from. So that's one of the main books I would recommend.
Cool.
Let's see, what else is there? It's hard at the top of my head, but yeah,
Sure.
I mean,
Yeah.
Paul
No sweat.
Gottfried and, like a lot of people, I think there was a time for like the reading of like Murray Rothbard, and you could read him on the progressive era and stuff like that. But like,
Yeah.
I think people need more practicality, and a lot less like theory. I don't think we're going to be helped along by better understanding like Lockean property rights. Like, I don't think that's going to do a lot to help us, gain power. But I would spend a lot of time in those people who have articulated, the science of power, like Paul Gottfried. I would read his, I would look up his commentary on like Antonio Gramsci, who was like the founder of the left's, cultural hegemony.
Yeah.
Like I would just read like those types of commentaries by Paul and even people like, James Burnham and, they're going to be challenging to people like libertarians. They're going to recommend solutions that are at odds with libertarianism. But I think they stretch your mind and they push you in more realistic directions. Also, I would say read history. You have to understand what happened in the 20th century from a perspective outside of the establishment court historian. I think you need to understand the development of history, what actually happened in Europe in the 20th century, what actually happened in America from an outsider's perspective in the 1960s and 70s. Actually, another book that I would recommend is Christopher Caldwell's book, The Age of Entitlement.
Okay.
It's kind of a reinterpretation of the 1960s and the Civil Rights Revolution, and he basically says that the American Constitution was replaced by a new Constitution, and America was refounded in the 1960s. So I would recommend that book too, The Age of Entitlements by Christopher Caldwell. Those are 2 books that I can think of at the top of my head. Obviously, I'm sitting amongst books, and if I looked around, I'd find some. You could also read. There's a little summary of James Burnham's thought by Sam Francis called Power and History. Unfortunately, it's hard to get and it's a little expensive, but I if you could find it, I would read that book, Power and History by Sam Francis. That would be the last one I recommend.
Very good. No, those are great recommendations. I appreciate that. So CJ, I want to honor the time commitment here. I really appreciate you coming on to the podcast today, and hope to do it again in the future. Thanks, and have a great weekend to you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, have a good one. Thank you.
This has been the California Liberty Project podcast. Make sure to subscribe, share it with others, and follow us on Instagram and Twitter.